Hi, everyone. I'm Thomas Chatterton Williams, a visiting fellow at AEI. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's event is part of the Edward and Helen Hintz book forums at AEI. These forums provide a platform to host prominent authors for discussion of their forthcoming books on issues of national significance. We're very grateful to Edward and Helen Hintz for their tremendous support of AEI and deep commitment to our mission. Today, I'm honored to be in conversation with an author and just a person that I deeply admire. Theodore Ted R. Johnson is the director of the Fellows Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. His work explores the role that race plays in electoral politics, issue framing, and disparities in policy outcomes. Previously, he was a national fellow at New America and a research manager at Deloitte. He's also a retired commander in the US Navy following a 2-decade career that included service as a White House fellow, military professor at the US Naval War College, and speechwriter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, Atlantic, New York Times Magazine, everywhere, among many other publications. He teaches law and public policy to master's and doctoral students. His debut book, When the Stars Begin to Fall, Overcoming Racism and Renewing the Promise of America, outlines a path toward a multiracial national solidarity to finally overcome the existential threat of racism in the United States. It was published by Atlantic Monthly Press earlier this week. Johnson holds a BS in mathematics from Hampton University, an ALM with a concentration in international relations from Harvard, and a doctorate of law and policy from Northeastern University. Ted, When the Stars Begin to Fall is a beautiful and moving book, written from the head as well as the heart. I was struck by your effortless ability to distill the macro down to the micro and to make clear what's at stake when we succumb to our prejudices and fears. Would you like to take 10 minutes or so to introduce it before we start the conversation? And then after that, we'll have time for audience questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks to you, Thomas, and to AEI for hosting me here and allowing me to talk about some of the ideas in this book that I think we're all concerned about in order to create the country that we'd like to see. Look, this book kind of came to me over many, many years. There was no epiphany, no light bulb. It's sort of like Slumdog Millionaire, where you pick up little pieces of the puzzle across your life, and then you're asked a question, and suddenly the puzzle pieces come together in a way that feels enlightening, feels like you have something to share, something important. And that's kind of how I see this book. So I describe the book as a three-legged stool of three-legged stools, which is to say there are batches of ideas, 3 batches of 3 ideas that sort of make up the heart of the book. So in this sort of opening bit here, I'll just quickly describe the main stool here, the big 3 ideas. The first is that racism is an existential threat to America. Now, this can sound a little bit alarmist. It seems like everything is racist everywhere we turn around these days. But I want to be clear what I mean here. The first thing is that I distinguish between the United States and America. I think of the United States as the geopolitical entity, the nation state, that is governed by its interests, not by an absolute sense of morality or good or bad, but does what is good for itself. And then I think about America as the ideals, the principles, the values that the nation was founded on, that we're all created equal and that we have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And the goal of this American project, the goal of our country, is to make the nation state live up to the ideals on which it was founded. We've not yet closed that gap. And frankly, I don't know if we ever will. But the opening premise of the book is that one of the reasons we've not yet closed the gap or we've not yet made more progress than we have is because of the role racism has played in our history and the way that history continues to infect the structures of our society today. So when I say racism is an existential threat to America, I'm basically saying that structural racism is a thing that prevents us from living up to the values we profess to hold dear. And we can talk more about that. What I'm not talking about is one group hating another or a nation hating a group of people. That's for different conversations in different places. I think this is about, do we have a nation that is fashioned in such a way that the work that I put in as a Black man is not unduly hindered simply because of the racial group I belong to. Okay, second part is that national solidarity is the best chance we have at overcoming the effects of racism. I do not think that we will ever erase racism from this country or from the world. I think it's part of the human condition, seeks out difference, and then and then conflict often results from these group differences. But what I mean by overcoming racism, I mean overcoming the effects of it, mitigating the effects of racism in our lives, which is to say, mitigating the role that race plays in the as a social determinant in our life outcomes and our life chances. And national solidarity is a means to accomplish this. There's a lot of scholarship around solidarity, political solidarity, civic solidarity, social solidarity. I think of national solidarity as the bonds of affection, the connection between citizens over a cause, a connection grounded in a cause that is just or moral, not a material thing, not self-interest, but over a moral or just cause that causes the citizens to come together in order to hold the state accountable for being in breach of its end of the social contract. So this is a matter of making the state be better. And this is a matter of people coming together over this moral cause. And it's a matter of the people holding the state accountable for not delivering on the thing that the social contract says, and for us, that's not just prosperity, opportunity, that's security, sort of standard state things, but also the ideals that undergird our country. The final leg of this broader stool is that Black America provides lessons for what this national solidarity could look like. Not that Black America is the only group in the country that has lessons for the nation. Every group, immigrants, Native Americans, women, you name it. If you've been marginalized, underrepresented in politics or elsewhere, but if you've kind of had to fight your way to be included in as a citizen or in this broader or in the full rights and privileges of citizenship, then there is something about that struggle that is very American, intrinsically American. And this book is looking at the Black experience. And so I say by looking at how Black citizens have practiced superlative citizenship to sort of show how much they want to be part of the American project and how compatible they are with it, to talk about the concept of trickle-down citizenship, which is compelling the state to accomplish what you want it to, not by making the moral case, but by marrying the moral case to a national interest, and then talking about the social solidarity within Black America that is a little bit different from the political and civic bits that make up the bulk of national solidarity. So the entire book is a way of explaining what national solidarity is and the threat racism poses, the lessons from the Black American experience, and then some of the conditions, like thinking about color consciousness versus color blindness, racism as a crime of the state, the role of the American civil religion, and helping us create the conditions that are conducive to the arising of a national solidarity so that we can finally make another step towards becoming that more perfect union and close the gap between the United States, the nation state, and the America of our ideals.
That's that's one of the better just like quick elevator pitches for a book that I've ever heard. You sound well rehearsed with that. I can't believe it just came out this week.
Right. I teach also, as you mentioned, so I could talk for an hour about some of this stuff, but I've been very cognizant not to dominate with my voice and do more engagement, especially at a place like AEI, where I think so many good ideas come from. There's lots of place for conversation here.
Cool. Well, let's get into the book then. I mean, early in the book, you have such a powerful scene when you addressed the White House Fellows Program several years ago. And you told them, quote, "Racism was the only thing that has ever proved strong enough to break up the nation. If we fail to keep our republic, it will be because we allowed racism to swipe it from us once more." Then you added, "But I also needed my audience to understand what racism felt like, how it shaped a different reality for one of their Black peers." I think you have an incredible ability to make this point really resonate. Do you sense that if everyone could simply feel racism for themselves, a lot of these problems would be resolved, or is it much more complicated than that?
I think it's more complicated than that. So what I do throughout the book, I open the book with a vignette from when I'm 12 years old, and I sort of walk through that and then jump ahead 3 decades to this moment where I'm delivering this speech to the White House Fellows Alumni Leadership Conference. And but the goal throughout is to tell not just not just describe the challenge that racism has posed our country, but to tell it in a way where the theories, the political science, frameworks, the philosophy of how societies work are given life and given a face by marrying them with my family story, from enslavement all the way through to my service as a military officer. And in this way, these theories aren't just these abstract concepts, but now we recognize when people made bad policy choices, or when people deliberately violated the Constitution out of political gain or because of some social view, that it wasn't abstract, that real people's lives were harmed in this way. So if more people could see that the struggle I describe in the book as a Black American is not that different from whatever struggle their family went through to become fully American. Again, whether they were immigrants from Western Europe or from East Asia or Native Americans or Hispanics, whatever, we've all had a process of becoming part of this America. Our country has always been expanding who it includes. It didn't begin with a very wide conception of who belonged. But I still think if people experience the kind of racism I describe in the book, whether the explicit interpersonal kind or the implicit structural kind, that means I have to earn twice as much as my neighbors where I currently live to live here, or that I had to serve 20 years in the military so that the GI Bill would allow me to buy a house without putting 20% down, and I could live in a house that would appreciate in value and is in a good school district. Like, those are major sacrifices I had to make just to live next door to folks that didn't have to make the same sort of sacrifices because they got to start at a better place than I was able to, and I had life pretty good growing up. So I still think even if people experience either the explicit kind or the implicit kind, I don't know that it will make it resonate to them that racism is the thing that harms the country. I think the only way that it works, the only way that it gets its power from the solidarity piece of it, that is to not necessarily experience something, but to recognize it exists and want to do away with it anyway. Even if you're not affected by it, even if you're not harmed by it, ultimately we're all harmed by this thing, but being able to see how it impacts the lives of others who only want to enjoy the full rights and privileges of citizenship just as you do, then I think that's when we've got a powerful idea, a concept that we can build a country around.
Yeah, I sense like a blues sensibility in your work, which I think of as quintessentially Black American. It's a kind of equipment for living, in Albert Murray's phrasing. For example, you write, "America is where I have achieved dreams that would have been impossible elsewhere, but it is also a haven for my deepest disappointments." That really resonated with me, and I think it put me in mind of my father, and it seemed to me to be really, I think if you're such an accomplished guy, but that you still have that kind of sense of it's inextricably linked to some disappointment. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Like this is the story that Black Americans have been telling about our country since forever. I mean, Frederick Douglass, James Baldwin, W.E. Du Bois, like every accomplished, well-known Black writer, thinker has talked about the tension between wanting to belong to a nation that for one reason or another refuses to accept you as you are. And as a military guy, that's especially frustrating because you see the promise of all that the nation has to offer and are willing to defend it to the death if need be. And then you come home and you take off your uniform and you jump in your car and go somewhere and, you see the blue lights and you're wondering, how is this going to go? Because when I am stopped by the police or any of these, in a department store or whatever, they don't see the degrees, they don't see the uniform. They just see another Black guy who, especially if they don't have exposure to, they may believe the stereotypes and the caricatures of what's put out there. So Du Bois talked about this tension. He called it double consciousness, or the two-ness of being Negro and American, these two forces that are seemingly irreconcilable. And only the strength of the Black American, the Black experience, prevents the two things, intention from tearing the person apart. And I see it a little bit differently. There's nothing incompatible about being Black and being American, except as society says that real Americans look like this, they believe like this, they act like this. And if you fall short of any of those things, then you are just a little bit less American than the others. And so the tension is pushed on us by a society that is unwilling to accept that America looks very different in many different ways, but is undergirded by the same belief and commitment to equality, liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness.
Well, that's a good way to start talking about one of the core concepts in your book is what you call the American promise. And that's an expression that you juxtapose with one that Ta-Nehisi Coates made famous or infamous, which is the American dream. So there's the American promise, which you say is not the same thing as the American dream. What's the difference for you?
Yeah. So for me, the American dream is primarily about economics, attainment. It's about upward social mobility. So to achieve the American dream is basically to do better in this country than your parents did, to be able to, have the middle class lifestyle, whatever that means from wherever you are in the country. The promise is not tied to economics. The promise is tied to principle. Do you believe in a country that is founded on the idea that we are all created equal? Do you believe in a country that ascribes unalienable rights to all of its citizens? If so, then the economics of that country, the education system, the judicial system, the healthcare system, all those things should roll out from that promise. And when the state installs structures or conducts itself in a way that undermines the promise for particular groups more than others, for no other reason than it's in its interest to do so, or because of some sort of social hierarchy that we've dragged from history, then we are falling short of the promise. And frankly, as I said in the opening, I don't know if it's possible, and I don't think it is, to have a truly equal society. I don't know if it's possible for opportunity to be truly equal, but it is absolutely possible for it to be horribly unequal. And we've seen that over the course of our history. And so the goal is to close those inequalities as best as a society can, as best as society would allow, as best as human nature would allow, in a way that allows us to live up to the promise. This doesn't mean that everyone is now living a middle-class lifestyle and there's no crime and we're sort of skipping off happily ever after into the frontier. It means that whenever challenges arise, we approach that challenge with the promise at the forefront and not trying to hoard more of the dream for ourselves or attain more economic security for us and those like us at the expense or to the exclusion of others. The promise is the thing that buttresses national solidarity. And it's the only thing thick enough, I think, to keep us together through times that will require sacrifice, forbearance, and not just bigger paychecks and nicer homes for everyone.
Yeah, but so the promise is something that really, it's like something that we can say, I think, people of goodwill could come together to see as being something that we're all duty bound to extend as far as possible. But how do we take into account that not everybody will be of goodwill? Mm-hmm. So how do we make the promise work in a society where I think we have to take into account the fact that some groups will never buy into that vision? That's something that I wrestle with in my own work too.
Yeah, it's tough. You're never going to get 100% of the people to say that that they're all in. Some people do believe this country was created for a specific type of person or a specific group of people, and everyone else are interlopers. Some people do believe that this country was created out of vile clay, and no matter how you shape the clay, it's never going to stop being vile, and so something else needs to happen. But I would argue that those people are on the fringes of society, and their views are not mainstream, even as much as spotlight as they're given. I think the vast majority of us want in America of our principles. So the goal is not to bring everyone into the fold. The goal is to make those in the fold resilient to the appeals of those who are outside. And so when the demagogues show up, when the sort of wolf in sheep's clothing folks show up saying that they want a better America and the way to get there is to divide us, then a society that has national solidarity will be resilient to those appeals. The solidarity will be thick enough to withstand those appeals. A society that is not well functioning, that is lacking solidarity, that treats the promise like a commodity, like it's a zero-sum game where the more equality you have, the less I have, that society will be highly susceptible to those divisive appeals. And I think we're watching this unfold, certainly over the last decade in America. Then those fringe groups begin to get more of a megaphone. People begin to sense that those fringe groups are not the fringe, but are actually the center of the two competing sides. And that spells disaster for our country. But more than that, the United States has proven quite well over its nearly 250 years that it can live comfortably with the liberalism, that it can live comfortably with the quandary of declaring equality and having people enslaved. And so it's not a matter of this is a matter of living up to the promise. The nation can become something less than the promise offers and still thrive. But it will not be an America we can be proud of. It will not be America at all. It will be a United States that is something completely different, no matter how much lip service it pays to the principles. It will be something that is unrecognizable to those who truly believe in the American promise.
So I take very seriously Barbara and Karen Fields' argument in their 2012 book, Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life, that racism, in fact, creates race. And therefore, we won't be able to transcend racism so long as we cling to the categories it bequeaths us. But you argue that racism is a structural crime of the state, and so overcoming it requires us to recognize that a color-conscious society, and not a colorblind one, is the true fulfillment of the American promise. You write powerfully that colorblindness may be an ideal morality for an ideal society, but in the real world, solutions that address, for example, maternal mortality rates require color-conscious policies to reduce racial inequality. Does that mean, in your view, we cannot and should not ever hope to abandon these abstract designations which don't exist on a biological level? And would this doom us to a permanent level of racism in our social lives that we have to tolerate?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And frankly, I've struggled with what happens if we ever achieve a country where the promise is available to the vast majority of us. Does that country still view race as an important identity, part of our personal identities? And I don't know, but what I do know is the best shot we have of getting to that state requires us to recognize race, because race has shaped so much of our history and is and undergirds so much of our present day problems. So the way to fix problems created by racial inequality is not to ignore race and just address the problem. As I see it, the role is the appropriate approach is to think about the particular experiences of different groups and craft policy to address those things. So if you want to create better educational policy in a colorblind America, for example, then you create good education policy and roll it out to everyone, and it's all the same for everyone, and then everyone benefits the same. But it just doesn't work that way, because white poor kids in Appalachia have a different set of educational challenges, social challenges, than poor Black kids in some metropolitan area. And so, coming up with a bunch of federal agents or federal workers coming up with the K through 12 curriculum for the country, and then expecting kids in the mountains of North Carolina and then, in Atlanta, in the heart of Atlanta, to have the same outcomes and grow at the same rate and based on this single monolithic uniform approach to education doesn't make sense to me. We have different challenges. And so I think we have to think about addressing our problem with race in ways that account for the history of race in this country, which requires it be color conscious. This is the goal here isn't to help one group ascend past another. The goal is to find the challenges each of our groups faced face that are most dire to these groups based on our history and our trajectory in the country, to allow those groups to touch the promise. And again, there's not a one size fits all here. It's sort of like the minimum wage debate we're having in the country, whether $15 should be nationwide or not. But $15 in New York is different than $15 in Idaho. And so adjusting minimum wage, for example, to be aligned to the cost of living wherever you are working makes sense. That kind of makes sense to me. Similarly, if you think about race as sort of the cost of living in America, then rolling out a one size fits all economic policy to help everyone doesn't address the particular cost of living, cost of the social challenges that different groups have faced in our country. So I think it has to be color conscious. And I think structural racism is the thing that makes policy produce. It's the thing that makes policy cause the hill people have to climb to touch the promise, to achieve the American dream, more different than other groups for no other reason than the group they belong to. And so this is why I call it a crime of the state. It is the responsibility of the state, where it has been in breach of the social contract, to help people achieve their to benefit from the sweat of their brow, to address these issues in our structures that allow them to sort of be cheated out of the work that they're putting in.
Yeah, I mean, this gets to the crux of what I find myself genuinely thinking about quite a lot these days, and wondering, if you want to get, because I really want to get to the kind of America you want to get to, like, of that I'm certain. But it gets a bit to a tension between equality of outcome and equality of opportunity. And I think that, it gets short shrift these days, but I do think a lot about the fact that there are aspects of culture, aspects of personality, like many different factors that contribute to, I think you can take there's a kind of racial binary that obtains in the States where we only juxtapose white and black, but you can juxtapose, lots of different groups, and you can see that groups of people in different regions at different times value different things. And I think a lot about these groups of Chinese and Korean immigrants in Flushing, Queens, and places like that, who really just decided that they will attack the standardized exams to get into, the specialized high schools. And it seems to me like there's no necessary policy that's determining that, but that's a group preference. They've prioritized that over New York City white kids, and they outperform them pretty powerfully as a group. So how is it incumbent on us to actually minimize all of those discrepancies? And mustn't there be some allowance for discrepancies that are not necessarily racist in nature? I guess that's what I'm wrestling with myself.
Yeah, so it's hard. It's hard to know, when have you beat racism? If you're if you're looking at just outcomes, then the suggestion is that to beat racism means that there is zero discrepancy between groups across a range of outcomes, and that's never going to happen. That
doesn't even happen in my own family with children.
Exactly. And so it's not about having equal outcomes, at least not for me. And it's not even about equal opportunity. I mean, the role of social capital is real. And I don't know that we can equally dispense or divide up social capital in a way that's fair for everyone. But I think group difference, as you also pointed out, does exist, and it does matter. It may not be biological, but there are certain, there's cultural differences, there are regional differences, et cetera. And I think it's worth paying attention to group differences, so that if you look at our criminal justice system and see that Black men are disproportionately incarcerated for the same crimes that white men are disproportionately put on probation or parole or some community service thing for, that signals that there's a problem in the criminal justice system, and that racial injustice exists in the criminal justice system. That doesn't mean that America is racist. And it doesn't mean that, as in America is racist, that it hates Black people and is seeking opportunity to lock Black people up because it hates Black people. And it doesn't mean that the only way that you've addressed that racial injustice is when there's zero discrepancy between white men and Black men. But the current state of things suggests that there is a problem, and it exists along racial lines. Now, either you can think Black people are culturally, intellectually, socially inferior and incompatible, and that's why they end up in jail more, or you can, I think the more American approach is to recognize maybe there's something about the way our criminal justice system operates that causes more Black people to be locked up than others. Maybe there's something about the way our society operates that two people who commit the exact same crime 10 miles away from one another end up with vastly different treatment or access to resources or whatever, and then end up with different outcomes in the criminal justice system. And so I think that's worth paying attention to across the range of socioeconomic factors. I don't know what victory looks like in terms of numbers, but in terms of outlook, when we as a society are angered by the fact that some groups, racial groups, are left behind by certain systems in ways that we can't attribute to anything else except disparate treatment or lack of equal protection of those groups, then that system is, by the sociological definition, racist, because it's producing disparate outcomes for no other reason than race, and requires color conscious policy to address it. Now, let's say we fix it. Let's say we highlight the disparity, we put in policy, and then there's still some group differences. But if that group difference is now shrunk, I don't know what the right margin is. Is it 5% difference? I don't know, but it ain't 80, it ain't 50. And so we can argue about what the right metric is to determine whether a system is fair or not. But I think we can all agree that many of our systems along lines of race and class, for example, make it more difficult for certain people to achieve certain things simply because of their race or their class. And I think public policy is the best method to address that in ways that are specific to the conditions that cause the disparity in the first place.
Yeah, and maybe I want to get into, before we turn over to the Q&A, I want to get into like the core of your book, The Solution, which you call national solidarity, or in a lovely turn of phrase, you call it civic kinship, which I really liked. You describe this solidarity as a kind of moral relationship among citizens, and you emphasize that Black Americans have an opportunity, which I really agree with you on, have an opportunity for significant leadership here, derived from particular experiences fighting for the equality embedded in the nation's founding ideals. But you also acknowledge any solidarity will require some real sacrifice from the status quo, many of whom in 2021, I'd venture, are not, strictly speaking, white, which complicates modern America. Contemporary America is a really complicated place. Plenty of minorities, for example, did vote for Trump. Or put differently, within minority groups, everyone doesn't speak with a single voice or necessarily agree on what's in our own best interest. So my question, I guess, is how might that broader solidarity be achieved in practice?
Yeah. So one, the solidarity is fashioned to make demands of the state and to hold the state accountable. And so the way states are responsive to their citizens is through politics, or through policy rather, and then the implementation of that policy in a fair and just way, and the enforcement of that policy when there are those who violate it. And so what solidarity would look like, a multiracial national solidarity, would mean when there are structures or policies that are implemented that end up resulting in certain groups being left behind more than others for no other reason. The only thing that distinguishes the group that is enjoying the full rights and privileges of citizenship and those who are enjoying a lesser version is the color line, then that's solidarity says demands of the state fix the inequity. The problem, there are a number of problems with this. One of them is that in any hierarchy, whenever you try to get rid of the hierarchy and create an egalitarian society where everyone is equal, not equal outcomes, not that sort of thing, but have equal access to the constitutional rights that are enshrined in our sacred documents. Those that have always enjoyed those things can feel a sense of loss when those who did not enjoy those things suddenly do. It means more competition at work. It means more competition at universities. It means your housing, your neighborhood looks different, your schools look different. And that change can be disruptive to people's lives in a way that feels like loss, even if it doesn't result in a material loss. That part,
the psychological wages of whiteness that Du Bois
exactly
talked about.
Yeah, exactly. Solidarity combats that impulse. Solidarity says, I am actually not losing by making democracy more available to more Americans. I'm actually not losing by making the American dream or the promise of America accessible to more Americans. This is the fulfillment of America. But again, there are too many that think that the promise, the dream, is a commodity. So if I'm able to hoard more for myself and my family to the exclusion of others or at the expense of others, that's just the cost of doing business in a dog-eat-dog capitalistic society. And the promise and solidarity says, no, we can be capitalistic about our wages or about, the housing market, but we have to be egalitarian and stand in solidarity when it comes to fundamental things like constitutional rights, like our equality, like our basic value as human beings. And so in practice, this is there is no code of conduct that says people who stand in solidarity with other people will do the following 10 things at all times. And if you do them, then you've basically achieved the epitome of citizenship and are a stalwart of Americanism. Instead, it is very contextual, it's temporal, and it's situation dependent, especially when we talk about things like race, which has been so divisive in our country. In this way, it can feel a bit nebulous. It can feel hard to, like quicksilver, you can't really grasp it. And the only thing I could suggest is to be what I call in the book, a superlative citizen, which is basically to not just meet the requirements of citizenship, the legal bits, but to be an exemplary citizen in all of the aspects of being a good person. In other words, solidarity is basically, national solidarity is the civic version of the golden rule, from the Bible. Love your neighbor like you love yourself. Well, if your neighbor is not being afforded the same rights and protections and privileges of citizenship that you are, through no fault of their own, then it is incumbent upon each of us to stand up for that neighbor and demand of the state that it deliver. I mean, if the government derives its power from the consent of the governed, the only way the governed can truly give their consent is if they stand in solidarity with one another. Otherwise, the state just finds a way to divide the people out of political expediency, because a divided country is easier to manipulate, to exploit, and to run roughshod over than one that's unified and making demands of a responsive state.
I mean, yeah, that argument you make actually reminds me of one that Mark Lilla raises in The Once and Future Liberal, where he writes that, when a motorist is extrajudicially killed by an officer of the law, it should anger and mobilize us all, because it's another citizen who has suffered, not because we have to see our race reflected in this person or anything, but as it should move us on grounds of citizenship.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And that's something. Go ahead.
Yeah. The original sin of our country is not that white people hated black people so much they enslaved them. The original sin is that a country founded on the idea that we are all created equal enslaved people. Never mind, race mattered. I mean, they were enslaved, but because of their race, and that has implications. But the sin was that a people declaring equality was a foremost thing to hold dear, enslaved people. When George Floyd was killed, lots of conversation was, I can't believe that this white man who was an agent of the state knelt on this black man and killed him on video for 9 minutes, 29 seconds. To your point, the real problem is that an agent of the state abused their power and killed a citizen. Period. Take race out of it. Period. Now, we know because of our history that George Floyd was more likely to be the victim in this than the perpetrator in this. But the fact that it happened at all shows how our country has fallen short of the promise. And the argument I make in the book is that racism is the thing that points out these shortfalls, these vulnerabilities, these shortcomings, the hypocrisy more than anything else. And so if we can address the scourge of structural racism, then we actually make the nation fairer for everyone. We actually make the promise more achievable for more people. To more people,
Yeah, that's a powerful insight, and I think that actually, you're in conversation with some of the most compelling points in like Racecraft, for example, when what you're talking about is a nation that said it was free was economically exploiting people and keeping them in bondage and defying his ideals. And so actually what has to happen is that there has to be an ideology of race that justifies that, because the
Right.
cognitive dissonance is too real. So that's how you actually get the racecraft that we're stuck and mired in today.
Right.
I love your point about George Floyd, and I would like to actually ask you, what do you take from, the past year, and is that not a kind of powerful examination? I mean, a powerful example of the kind of national solidarity you're calling for. Have we not seen so many instances of it, and of it becoming stronger?
Yeah. So I think last summer we got the best look at what national solidarity could look like if it were strong enough to endure and resilient. This is last summer. Not only is George Floyd killed, but Ahmaud Arbery is killed by some neighborhood vigilantes.
And it's covered up for
many months until the tape is made public. The coronavirus pandemic has changed the way the nation operates. People are sequestered in their homes. There's social distancing, stay-at-home orders. The economy sort of bottoms out because of the pandemic, and the government is not quick enough to respond to this falling out. I mean, we're arguing about whether to wear a mask or not, and whether to believe the science out of the CDC or not. And frankly, I think most Americans were just sick of it, sick of the politics, sick of the posturing and all the performative rhetoric and all of these things. And so what George Floyd's murder was a tipping point, in my view, for a public that was sick of a government that was dysfunctional, that was not being responsive to the demands of the people. And they had this nearly 10-minute video of the state abusing its power. And the state abused its power in the pandemic. It abused its power in its economy. It abused its power on tape in this law enforcement encounter with Floyd. And so the result is a summer where people of every race, party, religion, every state in the union, across generations, across ideologies, came together and protested. I mean, they were calling them racial justice protests, but what they actually were, in my view, were public protests that were really pissed off at the fact that the government was in breach of the social contract on a number of different factors. And we got a real taste of how upset we were, not just through the protests that happened, but when the presidential election occurred, the highest civic engagement, the highest voter participation in over a century. This is a nation screaming out that they are sick of the games. And I thought we got a taste of national solidarity. The problem, of course, is 2 months after the election, we have people storming the Capitol, and then we have politicians that are taking sides in the storming of the Capitol, where Confederate flags and Nazi flags are being flown in our state capitol, and cannot seem to agree that this was a bad thing worthy of investigation and castigation, and that those who contributed to its occurrence should be held accountable for that. And so that gives you a sense that even in those moments where national solidarity is tangible, even though if we don't agree on policy issues, that there is always someone willing to undermine the thing. Back to your question, what do we do about those that are working against the project? We see what happens when those folks are given voice and are encouraged to voice their disruptive, destructive version of what they think America is.
And it seems to me that that's actually a problem that we haven't necessarily put to bed. It might actually be a problem that's going to be with us for quite some time. So I guess my last question for you before we switch to the audience is, and I know this is an annoying question, but are you optimistic then?
Yeah, I am. And so, look, some of it is just because I was raised in the Black Baptist church in the South, and you're optimistic about everything. After the preacher spends an hour talking about the dangers of sin and hell, then, we all shout about going to heaven at the end, and we're in tears. And, so that's like the optimism is another one of the lessons from the Black experience, that no matter how horrible conditions may be, despite all proof, all evidence to the contrary, that tomorrow is going to be better. And I think that is not just a Black American attribute. I think it's intrinsically American to feel this way. So I am. The question is, the next time, and it's coming if we're not already upon it, that is going to require us to make difficult, principled decisions to create a better America. We can make the right choice, or we can make the politically expedient one. And the leaders we listen to will determine which direction we go. I am optimistic about the American project. I think the ideals are thick enough and strong enough to withstand it. I think Americans want this America and are strong enough to make it so. What I don't know is if we will live up to our potential. And that's an open question that has been around since the inception of the nation. And we will have our chance to have our say, and then we will leave to posterity either a better version of the country we inherited or a worse one. And that remains to be seen.
Man, I'd love to keep talking with you. Thank you so much. I've got a bunch of questions for you though that I have to relay. Ted, you talk about perfect equality being potentially impossible, but inequality being definitely real. In terms of policy and activism, do you think there's a difference between pursuing equality and fighting inequality?
That's a great question.
It's a good question.
I do think there's a difference. And so I like to think of these two things as truth-telling and bridge building. I think those fighting for perfect equality are truth-tellers. These are basically people who are saying, if you look at our founding documents, it says all of us are created equal. So I'm fighting until the state behaves in a way that suggests it also believes we're all created equal and therefore have these unalienable rights. But the bridge builder says, I believe that too, but that point is far off in the distance. And what I'd like to do is just take 2 steps in that direction so that the fight my kids pick up will be a little bit better, a little bit easier, will be a little bit closer to the goal than the one I picked up. And I think we're in that direction. I am much happier being a Black man in 2021 America than in 1921 America, and certainly than 1821 America. But that doesn't mean that we've reached perfect equality today, but it does mean the fight for inequality has borne fruit. And the progress we've seen over the course of the nation's history, over our lifetime, the nation's lifetime, is real and should be recognized and celebrated without us being happy, standing pat with
complacent.
What we've achieved so far.
Yeah. Here's another. Given that Black Americans have resources to offer a national solidarity, isn't the argument from many that other Americans aren't willing to listen to their experience? How should they proceed?
Yeah, so I think that the argument is that Americans will look at the Black experience and say, that's not my story. And so whatever lessons come out of the Black experience are lessons particular to Black people and their ability to navigate the country, and not for me. But if, in the book, I point out these, super citizenship and, group solidarities, these things, every group has experienced this. I mean, these aren't qualities that are specific to Black folks. These are qualities that helped Black people remain secure, sort of achieve more democracy, but help the nation become truer to itself. So I think, and the reason I tell family stories in this book and the reason I couch some of these ideas in the way I do is so that people will see themselves, see policy challenges that they recognize, see their family stories in these stories that are coming from a Black American about his family and the experiences of Black people in the United States, and recognize that we have similar desires and we have come up on similar problems. The particulars have been different, but the overarching thing we're striving for and the challenges we've come up against have been pretty similar, where equality has not been extended to us. So I think that the goal here is to see ourselves in other people so that when we see their challenges, we can recognize that our folks, our groups have often come up against those same things in different ways and in different points in history, but the same struggle to become fully American, truly American, and whatever that means is not a singular experience or singular challenge.
One argument sometimes made against solidarity is that it's a two-way street and America hasn't acknowledged its crimes or its history. Is there hope for solidarity in a country that cannot discuss its past without making truth adversarial? I think that's a really good question.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so if Americans cannot talk honestly about race, then the United States has no chance of ever living up to the American ideals. The nation state will do what the people require it to do because it's in its interest to some extent to be responsive to citizens, to have citizens who want to be part of the thing. And so the nation will only apologize for slavery, for example, or will only talk openly about racism when the people demand it to be so, because it's not in the nation's interest to point to the ways it's fallen short. The nation gains nothing. The nation state gains nothing by admitting it's weak and it's wrong and that it's fallen short. It only gains by showing all the ways that it's strong and resilient and offers opportunity. So it's incumbent upon the people to be willing to have an open and earnest conversation about the history of racism and the promise of America together, instead of bickering over, which takes salience, the things we did wrong or everything we've gotten right. The real question is the line that connects those two dots is the thing that should bring all of us together. And unless we're willing to do that, unless we're willing to create bonds of affection across the color line, then there's really no hope for the United States to ever reckon with its past.
And there's another question for you. Given that racism is a crime of the state, are reparations a substantive contribution toward solidarity via state acknowledgement of complicity?
Yeah, and so here's the thing. In an unhealthy society, something like reparations can be weaponized to further divide the society that's already in bad shape. So never mind, I don't want to have the discussion of how much is reparations and who gets paid and all that sort of stuff. What I want to say is, let's say reparations are issued to Black folks tomorrow. Because of the way race operates in this country, one, it will be a divisive issue. It already is. But more than that, the day after reparations checks are paid out, we will see the most exploitive financial vehicles the world has ever seen to reappropriate the money that's been reappropriated to Black people, because Black Americans are not valued in the same way in our society than others are. And so when the housing bubble burst, it burst on Black folks first. When the coronavirus pandemic made unemployment skyrocket, well, Black folks, it skyrocketed on them first. And so policy solutions are necessary, but they are insufficient to address this issue that I'm talking about in the book, which is our unwillingness, our inability, or our stubbornness and seeing ourselves and people who are different from us and finding bonds of solidarity with them simply because they are our compatriots, simply because they're fellow citizens. So reparations is important as a conversation piece. Apologies for slavery and Jim Crow are important only in that for the state to do any of this means the state sees it's in its interest to address to reckon with its history on race. And that is the win in my book, more than whatever policy solution comes out of it. I think we can overcome the effects of racism without doing reparations if we have a state that is truly interested in racial equality, because all of our policy from that point forward is going to be color conscious and is going to close gaps in education and housing and healthcare and all these other areas, because we are looking at it through the lens of reckoning with what racism has wrought. And but if we look at reparations as, okay, if we do this, then maybe they'll shut up and we can move on with the business of the country, that is not going to be the solution that creates racial equality.
It's a really interesting answer. So are you, is it fair to say that you're not necessarily for reparations?
I am for the state reckoning with racism. And I am agnostic about the ways that can happen, because if we don't do the first thing, then whatever happens after that is still going to reproduce racial inequality. If we issue, again, reparation checks to tomorrow in order to even out the racial wealth gap, to give Black folks $100,000 per household so that now Black wealth and white wealth is the exact same, there will not be racial equality the Tuesday after that happens, because there's something flawed in the way we view one another. There's a lack of solidarity with one another, so that when the politicians looking to exploit those who received money, or exploit the tensions from those who received money and those who didn't, they will be successful because there are no bonds of solidarity. My thing, look at the way we're talking about reparations now. There's this move to pass HR 40, which has been happening, for many, many years now. It never gets passed out of the House, or if it gets out of committee, then it never gets through the Senate. It never happens. And everyone says, look, I'd be willing to support this if it ever got out of the Senate. It's never going to get out of these. And so this is a way of avoiding the question. If people were truly serious about exploring the cost of slavery and Jim Crow, then they would do what Johnson did and what Truman did. They would establish presidential commissions to do the study, and then to come back to the country with, this is what we found from a bipartisan commission and scholars, et cetera, about the cost of these bad racist policies from 200 years ago and the effects they're having on our ability to be competitive and prosperous today. And the fact that that has not happened suggests to me that the nation isn't serious about interrogating its history and its ramifications for today. So for me, whether I'm for or against reparations is like the tertiary question after we figure out, is the nation serious about the promise? And are we serious about investigating the harms that the racism from our history has caused that are still permeating in society today? Are we serious about addressing those things structurally? If we are serious about the first two, then whether or not we do reparations is like, that's that's the easy question, because we could leave policy as it exists today, and people would not be willing to accept politicians who are dividing us, who are looking to exploit racial tensions, because we're standing in solidarity with one another. And so, we would see more racial equality across socioeconomic factors, because we would be intolerant of racial injustice.
That's quite an answer. I really appreciate that. I'll be thinking about that, actually. It navigates somewhere between Ta-Nehisi Coates and like Glenn Lowry, who says just no, right, because it will just cause tension and it'll make things worse. It's a really sophisticated answer that I think addresses both concerns in a way I haven't heard before. Thank you. And we have one more question, and it's apparently for both of us. There are cases where groups have experienced such violence that they either want to simply escape the nation that has hurt them, or they actively think it needs to be broken to be fixed. How do you both think we should engage with these perspectives if we disagree?
Yeah, wow, it's a big question. I remember a few years ago, there was, I wouldn't even call it a movement, but there were like rumblings of Black Americans saying, I'm moving to Ghana or to the Caribbean because I just can't take it here anymore. Or we've heard folks that say, look, the American, it's corrupt to the core, and so we need to like burn the thing down and start over. I don't agree with either one of those. Too many Black people died, bled, sweated for us to be here in conversation today. And I'm not abandoning that project. I spent 20 years of my life in uniform. I'm not abandoning this nation. It's mine. I earned every bit of it, and I'm not walking away from it. But I also recognize it's imperfect. And that's not just me. The last few numbers I saw from maybe 18 months, 2 years ago, it was something like 2/3 of American thinks our nation needs fundamental democracy reform, redesign. And that's the majority. I think it was 50% of Republicans and something like 70% of Democrats thought this, and may even be maybe 75% of Democrats. But it's not partisan to say our democracy is not working the way it should, that our government's not responsive, and that we need fundamental democracy reform in order to create a nation that's closer to the promise. So I'm not a fan of abandoning the thing or burning it down. I am a fan of bleeding and sweating and toiling away to make the thing a little bit better than it is today.
I am too. We're almost out of time, so I don't have quite a long answer or the time to make a long answer, but I mean, I have left the nation and I'm talking to you from Paris now. So
right.
I have a complicated answer to that. I didn't run from the nation because I felt it was hurting me, but I do have this view that is, if the democracy is flawed, and if you're not getting some of the things that you want out of society in the circumstances you happen to be born into. I have a kind of immigrant mentality that I think can be applicable to Americans, and Americans don't usually think of themselves as people who emigrate.
Right.
I think the world is large and we can pursue opportunity on more of a national scale, but the point that you raise is one that I fundamentally believe, which is that I am an American and this is my country and my society, and I don't give up on that. And so I have a kind of fundamentally American mentality mixed with an immigrant mentality about go get that job in London if it's there. So
right.
Which
is to say you are an American and not a United Statesman. You know, like there's a distinction there. You know, you can leave the country and still harbor it inside you. And as a military guy overseas, I know that very, very well. So I completely feel your answer for sure.
Cool. Well, we are right at time, and I mean, I could talk to you for hours. You're full of insight. Thank you so much for joining us here. I think everybody appreciated it.
I appreciate both you and AEI for having me.
Cool. Good night. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Thanks.